Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to American History Class with Mr. Fulcher, live from futuristic dystopia, which admittedly, honestly, doesn't seem as bad as it seemed like in all the sci-fi movies. I've actually been having a pretty good time. I hope you have as well. Hope you enjoyed being with your family and being able to work at your own pace a little bit more and all of that stuff. I know it's turbulent times out there, but I hope I hope you're not giving in to fear and losing sight of the fact that even though there's financial trouble coming in different places, and even though there's people getting sick and all this stuff, times like this, it really is important to know that we have to be able to trust in the Lord. And I hope that really that this time is a good opportunity for you, really even to grow spiritually. And I hope you've taken advantage of that. You've got a lot more time to spend with the Lord and stuff like that. And I hope you would take these weeks that we're doing this kind of home study format, and I hope that's going to give you a little bit more free time, and you don't have many places to go or places to hang out and all that kind of stuff. So I hope you take some of that time and really invest it in your walk with God, because I think that would be a great way to come out of this whole scenario. It's going to blow by at some point, and hopefully come out of that better off than when we went in. But of course, since this distance thing is going to last a little bit longer than we first expected, I thought maybe now would be the time to try to bring myself into the 20th century, now that we're 2 decades into the 21st, and try to figure out how to do some of this YouTube stuff and stuff like that, so that you can actually have a little bit of a lesson, kind of help. I know you're reading some of this stuff in the book and that kind of thing, but maybe help kind of frame at least the highlights of your chapter. And hopefully help you kind of grasp what are the big ideas and some of the material that I would normally kind of add in class that doesn't come up in your textbook or whatever. Have a chance to bring up some of that, especially since this distance thing is going to extend into World War II. And really, I mean, it would pretty much suck to be a history teacher and not get to talk about World War II. That's a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. So. With that, today is the first lesson of several that we'll do here. And we'll kind of take a couple videos here and try to review the basics of the Great Depression. I know y'all have kind of probably read most of the chapter by now, and then obviously you got some time this week where you're working on your reports. But nonetheless, I would like to kind of go over and make sure that you have, the gist of what we're supposed to talk about with the Great Depression. If I occasionally stutter, I'm a little thrown off because I'm used to looking at students and I'm looking at my reflection in a mirror, and it's just kind of strange. I'm seeing myself talk. It's weird. But anyway, I'm not exactly been used to being a TV star. I never get nervous speaking in public, doing it every day, but for some reason I'm a little nervous speaking in my own study room here. So notice the books to prove that I'm actually an intellectual and not just playing one on TV, or doing my best to be anyway. All right, so when we last left our heroes, as we say, we were kind of coming into some rough times that I really hope are not repeating themselves, although I have some concerns, at least in the natural, about that. And that was the beginning of the period of time spanning, most of the totality of the 1930s and even the early 1940s. That is known as the Great Depression. And of course, the real beginning of the Great Depression happens in October of 1929, on the day that they call Black Tuesday. And that was the day when we, last time we had an opportunity to kind of discuss as a class, we were talking about the reality of how the 1920s were this decade of unparalleled prosperity in American history. Consumer technology was in a different place. People were starting to have dishwashers. They were starting to have, more people had cars than any time before. You have the invention of, well, not necessarily the invention, but things were starting to become more widespread that had been restricted to, a small, rich elite at one point in time, and now more people have leisure time. The radio is really taking off, movie industry is taking off. You've got the whole Roaring Twenties, thing with prohibition and speakeasies and all this crazy stuff that we associate. So we associate the 1920s as a time of wealth, a time of materialism, a time of prosperity, but some of it was a bubble that was a little bit inflated. And come 1929, people had kind of had such an expectation that stock prices were just going to go up and up and up that people were just buying on a speculative basis, thinking that bad days would never come again. So they're continuing to do the same thing. They're continuing to charge more and more and more. And in addition, this was the 20s was a decade where credit was really easy to get. And a lot of people in America, as they are today, were living well beyond their means, buying things they really could not afford, taking advantage of credit. And this included buying a lot of stocks on margin, where people were actually borrowing money from stockbrokers to buy stock that they then would pay more, pay back with interest later on. It kind of the market begins to come into an economic correction where people begin to realize that these stocks are actually valued far above what they will actually be able to cash out at some point in the future. People start realizing that these are overvalued properties. The stock market begins to slowly go down. And then on October 24th of 1929, they have something they call Black Thursday, where prices really begin to fall down until a lot of financiers wound up trying to buy stuff to bring things back up to a normal level. But things get really bad the Tuesday after, what they call Black Tuesday, which is October 29th of 1929, where the stock market lost $30 billion in one day. And I had pulled up that number on my trusty inflation calculator and just remembered I can't look at it because it's recording me. My telephone is. But I looked up the numbers, and if I recall correctly, that was the equivalent of about $430 billion today. Just vanishes, that much value vanishes from the stock market in one moment. At the time, people are kind of hoping that this is just a readjustment and things will get back to normal, but things don't get back to normal for a long time. And so you have a handful of things really cause this extended period of economic struggle that they called the Great Depression, which was a general nationwide poverty that spread across the majority of the country. Some of the factors that led into this, you got to remember the whole situation of World War I is lingering in the background. Europe is economically devastated. Britain and France demand Germany are paying them reparations. Germany can't make the reparations. So if you remember, America had to set up a situation starting with the Dawes Plan, where we were actually lending money to the Germans that they used to pay off debts to Britain and France that they then used to pay off debts that were owed to America, in this kind of weird kind of circular thing. But that system starts to break down over time. Eventually, we'll talk about this more as we get into the Great Depression, that eventually leads to the Depression spreading to Europe in a powerful way, because American investment was really propping up that whole cycle. When that American investment disappears, Germany in particular is going to get economically devastated, which is going to help pave the way for Hitler to come to power and bring bad times for everybody in the years that would follow. So you've got the whole situation of World War I is an economic weight. In addition to that, you have too much easy money policy by the Federal Reserve, which again was the kind of mixed private-public system that was established under the Wilson administration that would kind of manage the American money supply. And the Federal Reserve Bank, of course, if you pulled out a dollar out of your wallet, it would say Federal Reserve note on it. They're kind of responsible for bringing the money supply out into the world. And they were very easy on credit for a long time. Really low interest rates was kind of created an artificial boom where the values of things like mortgages kind of went through the roof, which meant that real estate and stock and some other things kind of were artificially inflated by a bubble that was inevitably going to bust. And so as soon as the Federal Reserve realized, we need to tighten our belt here, as far as interest rates are concerned, and starts to back off of the easy money, the whole system comes crashing down. And then probably the thing that really takes the Great Depression from bad to worse, because one thing about it's just the nature of the market. If you leave the market alone and government doesn't intervene and you just let it work through its functions, the market is going to have a natural boom bust cycle because people are going to start to realize, for instance, that these stocks are overpriced, and so we're going to have a correction and things are going to go down, and at some point it'll go back up again. It's just the free market naturally does this. Well, a lot of times, though, when you hit the bust cycle, the government overreacts and does things that wind up being detrimental. And perhaps the best example of this, as it relates to the Great Depression, there were several, but the most important was a bill that was signed by President Herbert Hoover that was known as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. And the Smoot-Hawley Tariff was a terrible, terrible, terrible idea. And the thing is, it's virtually impossible for the government to just snap their fingers and get us out of an economic crisis. It just doesn't work very often. But it is very, very easy for them in a panic, in a rut, to do something that winds up being highly detrimental and makes things worse because you think things are at bottom, and you can always trust the politicians to find a way to make it worse. I haven't been following the news all that much the last couple of days. It kind of got a little depressing, to be honest. So I don't know how this went, but I know at one point there was some controversy about one of the first relief bills that was proposed. They made it to where businesses under 500 employees, once that you, or whatever the number was, but basically that required small businesses to give paid work leave and sick leave in the case of coronavirus stuff, but didn't make the same requirement of larger businesses. And I don't know what kind of money was talking when they came up with that, but that's obviously insane. The idea is that would draw, that's almost designed in a laboratory to destroy small businesses, right? So stuff like that happens, in what's supposed to be a relief bill. People are kicking around policies that would actually make the crisis a lot worse than it has to be. People are in the process of doing that as we speak. So hopefully this turns out better than the Smoot-Hawley tariff. So Smoot-Hawley, they raised tariffs on the vast majority of things, and it is so high that it functionally shuts down European trade. Again, the response, the reason people want tariffs is they say, we don't want foreign competition. We should be strengthening American businesses by ridding them of foreign competitors during this economic crisis so that, people are buying them from American companies and American stock prices go up, and pay out dividends to American investors. Well, the problem with that is several. The first is that when you put a high tariff on a country, they typically retaliate with high tariffs as well. So you wind up, by shutting down your imports, you wind up shutting down your exports oftentimes. And the other thing is that a lot of, and this is even more the case now than it was in the 20s, but it was already an issue in the 20s, that sometimes, what you call a supply chain, that is the things that go into making the products that you sell, the tariff on steel drives up the price of steel. Well, steel goes into every automobile, which means that every automobile becomes more expensive to make. And so, for instance, the automobile industry, which is one of the really thriving industries of the 1920s, goes downhill significantly in the 1930s because people don't have the power to buy them anymore because they're getting more expensive because there's a tariff on everything that's in it. So tariffs had unintended consequences. So that's one of the various responses that Hoover had to it. Hoover is criticized heavily for his reaction to the Great Depression. In fact, there gets to be a movement of shanty towns and what they would call hobo jungles and stuff like that, where hobos would set up shop in an area. Hobos were those people, perhaps you've seen them in movies or old cartoons or something. They would kind of ride the rails, hunting for work where they could find it, or begging if they didn't want to work. And oftentimes you'd see pictures of them in movies and stuff with lunch bag thrown over their shoulder or what have you. But the true story, I talked to an old man in Kentucky one time. We were on a missions trip out there in the Appalachians, and he would tell this. This guy was the greatest storyteller you ever heard. He was an old coal miner, and he'd begin to tell us stories about their town in the 1930s, and they had a particular sheriff there who hated this trend of the hobos, who thought they were a bunch of no-goods, and so on. And so he actually would sit by the train tracks with a shotgun and would just fire shots off at the poor hobos. This is the guy in charge of law enforcement in your town. Not a good sign. But a lot of these shanty towns or hobo jungles or whatever that would be set up, they would call them Hoovervilles, was the name that they would give them in the common parlance. So Hoover gets a lot of blame for the Great Depression. It's not really his fault necessarily, but he also didn't really find any way to fix it. There's a little bit of a myth, especially among liberals, that the Great Depression was this result of Herbert Hoover just having these wildly laissez-faire economics and not intervening at all. And in reality, that's not the case. Herbert Hoover, if you remember, was from the more progressive wing of the Republican Party. He had actually worked as Woodrow Wilson's food administration guy in World War I. He does try a more limited response than does Franklin Roosevelt, who's ultimately going to replace him in the next presidential election, which we'll look at in our next video. He does try to take a more privatized approach. In particular, he's not a fan of the idea of the dole or any kind of welfare that didn't carry with it a strong work requirement. He does start to dabble in the idea of what they call make-work projects, which is where they start to create jobs that aren't necessarily even needed, but they establish them just to, create jobs, government jobs programs, and so forth. FDR is going to take that to the next level, but Hoover's going to do some of it. But Hoover starts with this process of trying to create voluntary cooperation was the term he used with a lot of the leading industrialists, trying to keep wages kind of artificially high for the sake of the economy as a whole and so forth. And some of the companies play ball for a while, but after a couple years, they're not really capable of doing it anymore. He does create something called the Reconstruction Finance Administration, and that gets a little bit of criticism for really kind of helping. That's the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It gets a little bit of criticism for that, for kind of helping big business more than the average man, was a lot of the criticism people would have at the time, although there's economic reasons why they made some of the decisions that they made. So the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was basically there to try to keep businesses, especially banks, functioning, kind of similar in principle to what happened under the Bush and Obama administrations after the 2008 financial crisis. But probably the low moment for the Hoover administration, the thing that is maybe seals the deal politically, was this terrible, terrible incident known as the Bonus Army incident. And there's just no way to spin this as a good thing. So at the end in World War I, a number of veterans had been promised bonuses, because they had served, the government didn't have time to pay them a certain amount of money for maybe reenlistment bonuses or things like that, but they had been promised that they would be given bonuses at a certain time. And it still hadn't come. 10 years later, there had been this long period where these bonuses had not been paid, and despite the fact that America had a better 1920s. But now we have this dramatic change where the gross national product, or GNP, of America, which is our what we create, the value of our combined economy, the value of all goods and services that a nation produces. In 1929, it was $104 billion. $104 billion in 1929. By 1932, it's down to 41. So we're talking, it is, the economy has lost 67% of its value, give or take, in a 3-year period. That's not a good deal because the economies are a weird thing. They can one thing leads to another, and the fact that a lot of the businesses lose their value means that their investors can't invest in businesses, which means there's not enough. Eventually, wages go down. Well, wages go down. Now people have less money to buy stuff. So you run a store, and in a town, let's say you're in Detroit, because they were the where the plants were that made the Ford and all the other vehicles at the time, Motor City and so forth. Well, you're used to charging a certain price based on the economic condition of the workers in the area who have these decent union jobs working on automobiles. Now they're all getting their wages cut. Now you're not being able to sell as much. They don't have money to buy your stuff. So then the store closes, right? So now you've got, and then as the unemployment goes up, the supply of available labor sitting there, you can't really press for higher wages because there's lots of people that would take your job in a heartbeat. So you might not have enough to really feed your family with your job, but if you were to ask for more, they don't have it. And if they have it, they could fire you tomorrow and there'd be somebody else that could, that would gladly take the job you have. So one thing leads to another. Unemployment is at one point in the Great Depression, unemployment hits 24%. So you're talking about literally 1 out of every 4 people that's hunting for work can't get it. Now this is at a period of time where you typically had one person working in the household. You did have some women working, but not anywhere near as much as we're used to in today's culture. So we're not even counting like all the women who are homemakers and content with that. My understanding is that those labor statistics are those that were actively looking to be involved in the workplace couldn't get it. So you got basically no women working, and then 1 out of 4 men is unemployed too. When you got this many people unemployed, who are you selling to? Like, for you to sell things to people, you have to have a customer, and the customer has to have money. So now, one thing is leading to another. The economy is in a bad shape, and these World War I veterans start saying, hey, we were owed these bonuses, and the government has never come through. So they actually set up shop, set up a little shanty town in Washington and protest that they've not been given their bonuses. They appeal to Congress. Congress does nothing. They appeal to Hoover. Hoover does nothing. But Hoover's starting to get politically embarrassed by the situation because there's this little Hooverville of veterans, thousands of World War I of poor veterans. They risked their lives for their country. Survived. Some of them had lost limbs. Whatever, but they come back, they're vets, they fought for America, and they're impoverished. The government owes them money, and the government won't pay them money. Well, and the government's saying, what money do we want to pay you with? We can't pay, we don't have it. So Hoover orders a fellow by the name of General Douglas MacArthur was in charge of an army unit. They're stationed nearby. MacArthur is going to be a major player in the next couple chapters because he's the commander of American forces in the Pacific during World War II, and he's also the commander of American forces during the Korean War. And I'm generally an admirer of Douglas MacArthur for his leadership during the war, but you do have to understand the man... He's a complicated figure. You can't just say Douglas MacArthur good or bad. The answer is Douglas MacArthur a good guy or a bad guy? Yes. Because he has an unbelievable ego. The guy thinks he rules the world. And he's not opposed to exceeding orders when he's given the chance. And we'll see this literally cost him his career in Korea because he's wanting to... We shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. But anyway, let's just say he doesn't always just want to stop at what the boss wants to say. He's definitely a take charge type personality. And so MacArthur winds up using a lot more force than was anticipated. So Hoover says, General MacArthur, get your troops, disperse the so-called bonus army, this group of veterans that was protesting. And MacArthur comes out and just takes the use of force to well beyond what Hoover intended. They're out there just cracking skulls with bayonets. I mean, not bayonets, with clubs. I mean, actually, your textbook is saying there were bayonets used. Okay, so they're bringing tanks out in the streets. They're tear gassing. These are World War I veterans. And General Patton, who winds up being, who's another kind of great World War II hero with a little bit of an egotistical streak. Patton is also there at the bonus army and actually winds up being involved in, rounding up a guy that had gotten a medal in World War I for saving Patton's life. So it's this terrible thing where, the United States Army is attacking veterans who are asking for better pay that they actually were owed. Well, this is not going to look good under any circumstances for Hoover. Hoover does wind up taking responsibility for what happened, but the political damage was done. The other thing that Hoover does is that, Hoover really thinks that running deficits in this crisis would be a really bad thing. He wants a balanced budget in the midst of it, but he's also spending a little bit of money on relief, not as much as Roosevelt would, but he is spending some. So what winds up happening is Hoover winds up raising a number of taxes. And you don't want to raise taxes in the middle of a recession. It's just not a good thing. So you already have people with less money. You already have high unemployment. You already have all these things going. Now, what money people have, the government wants a bigger chunk of it. And a lot of these taxes were like excise taxes. He raises income taxes too, but a lot of them were taxes on particular goods. So when you buy them, you pay an extra tax on it, so it makes more things expensive. Not a good idea. He probably honestly would have been better off running deficits than trying to raise taxes in the middle of the recession. So ultimately, he is challenged for the presidency by a fellow by the name of Franklin D. Roosevelt of New York, who is going to be probably the most important president of the 20th century. I think most people would agree with that. He gets to be president longer than anyone else ever has. He's president for 12 years. Actually was voted in to serve 16 years, but he died very early in his fourth term. They've since changed the Constitution to where you can't do that anymore. But ultimately, Roosevelt, who had been governor of New York before running for president. He's an interesting character. He actually had crippling polio, so he actually is in a wheelchair. The parts of that were kind of hidden from exactly how disabled he was physically. Was kind of hidden from the American people for a period of time. But Roosevelt winds up winning re-election, and we'll talk plenty about FDR in the next couple of videos here because, again, most important president of the last 100-some years. But one thing that happens between Roosevelt's winning the election and actually being inaugurated, something happens where there's a huge banking crisis. And what happens is there's a big run on the banks, meaning this. If you're not familiar with how a bank actually makes its money, what they do is you take your money to the bank, you put it in the bank, and so have hundreds of other people. Well, they're required to keep a certain amount of that cash on hand where if people want to withdraw it, they can get it. But because they're going to have more money than anyone's ever going to withdraw at once, they take a certain percentage of what's in the bank and they invest it in the stock market and buy stocks. And this is how banks exist. And then they take a portion of what they make doing that. They use that to make, because they've got a lot of cash on hand, they then take some of that and make loans on your house or your car or whatever, and then you pay them back with interest. And so this is kind of how banking works. They make money off of using the money that you deposit, but they have to keep a certain amount around for you in case you want it out, right? So, well, what happens in the banking crisis is people start to realize that the banks are starting to go wobbly financially, that they're in a lot of trouble, and the idea is if the banks close, your money goes with it. So people start to realize there's a problem, and they start trying to all get their money out of the banks. Well, all these people go at once to try to get money out of the banks. Problem is, they don't have it all. It's not all there. And so you've got, nowadays, they have something called the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance, this was actually an idea of Franklin Roosevelt's, one of his better ones. Your money is guaranteed in the bank, like the government is guaranteed to, reimburse you if you were to lose it in a banking run like this, up to a certain dollar figure, which I believe is in 6 digits, if I'm not mistaken. I have to double check that. The fact that some stranger from Bangladesh might be watching this video on YouTube makes me a little more hesitant about throwing out numbers from my memory. It's like, but in class I just go with it. I think that's right. But now I've got I probably have idiots commenting in the back like, you're an idiot. Anyway, so So anyway, so they guarantee you up to a certain number now, so this can't happen again. But back then they didn't have that. So literally, these banks, a lot of these banks just fail and close, and people had their life savings in the bank, and they're gone. Everything they'd stored up for retirement is gone, disappeared in the flash of an eye. And if you wonder why people of a certain age, of a certain generation, kind of have their doubts, or I don't trust the banks or whatever, it's because that memory lived long with that generation. And it took a long time before people kind of had their faith in the American banking system restored. So Hoover had some ideas about kind of how to help this. Roosevelt, though, he knew nothing was going to be able to pass without Roosevelt's say-so, though, because he was the president-elect. And Roosevelt really didn't want to give Democrats in Congress kind of the okay to go along with any sort of Hoover policy before he gets in there, because he didn't want to get stuck with the ramifications of it. So it just happened at a terrible time, for the government to really be able to respond to it in any way. So you have, and ultimately what's going to happen when Roosevelt takes over, he's going to call what they call a bank holiday and kind of freeze the banking activity until the panic subsides. But by then, a lot of damage had already been done. So that's kind of the Great Depression, the first phase here. On our next video, we're going to look at the way Roosevelt responds, what is known as the New Deal, and it's the most important program that any president has ever introduced, certainly since Lincoln. Whether you like it or not, you may be, a conservative critic of it. You may be a supporter of it, either as a liberal or as a moderate. But no matter what, it changes the relationship between America and government permanently. There's really no chance of ever going back to a pre-New Deal existence that I can see. Even the most conservative or small government leaders that we've had in recent decades, guys like Ronald Reagan and people like that, wouldn't dream of undoing parts of the New Deal. So it's a very, very important thing, which will require its own video. Plus, we'll see if this thing even loads. So anyway, hope you enjoyed this. Hope you're enjoying your quarantine, and hopefully I'll see you in a few weeks.